Now, the rest of the story. It ran in the family, of course, manic depression, or something like manic depression. Now Eugene was certain that he had succumbed to it. The highs, well, if only they'd last indefinitely, but naturally they didn't. In fact, they were inevitably followed by lows so low that Eugene feared the worst, that he was having a nervous breakdown. He was turning into his father, wasn't he? His father, Percy, a big band saxophone player who eventually sold his instrument in his dreams and settled for a third-rate accountant's job. A job so unsatisfying that he hardly minded getting fired and plunging his family into poverty. Nice fellow, Eugene's father. Nice to a fault. Would hand you his shirt in the desert even if the sun was blistering his own back. And for his niceness, what did he get? More people asking for his shirt and a standard greeting from his father-in-law, "Hey, loser." Pops just wanted folks to like him, didn't he? What was so wrong with that? Well, everything was wrong with that, Eugene surmised. Now, barely in his 20s, he realized that he was afflicted with that same disease. Please, somebody, like me. Maybe Eugene should just try to relax a little and make a painting or something. So he made a painting of his father, his dad holding a stopwatch and a starter's pistol. Eugene titled the painting, "Waiting to Die." The more he stared at the canvas, the more he remembered of the teenage years he'd tried to forget. Pops was just receiving his pink slip and was telling Eugene and his mother and 3 siblings what life was going to be like for them. They'd be selling the house. They'd be living in their VW camper van. The boys would be dropping out of school so they could all go to work, Dad included, in the local tire rim factory as night guards and janitors. "We're going to be homeless?" Eugene asked Pops incredulously. Yes, they were going to be homeless. And everything Dad had predicted did come to pass. Slowly, relentlessly, the anger grew inside 13-year-old Eugene. Anger so intense that in the months that went by, he and his brother John sometimes got drunk on beer and went out on sprees of vandalism. That is, when they were not pushing those electric sweepers down the aisles of the tire rim factory. Suddenly, Eugene jolted from his dark reverie, still staring at the painting that he had once completed. His eyes drifted to the starter's pistol in his father's hand, but it wasn't a starter's pistol at all. It was a loaded gun, and his father in the painting was preparing to commit suicide. One way or another, Eugene decided this was not going to happen to him. Whatever it took, he would leave the painful memories of living in a camper van in Newmarket, Ontario, where they were in the past. And love Pops though he did, and always would, he would never, ever become his father. And he never did, except for once, in a character he created for a motion picture called The Mask. A mild-mannered, ineffectual daydreamer named Stanley Ipkiss, based on Eugene's real-life father. Until this moment, I think you never knew the desperate young man haunted by recollections of homelessness and so certain that he was losing his mind. But you have seen his nervous breakdowns, if only on the movie screen. The incomparable, overwhelming, over-the-top art of James Eugene Carey. Jim Carrey? That's right, the comedian, Jim Carrey. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. James Eugene Carey was born in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada on January 17, 1962. He's the youngest of 4 children born to Percy and Kathleen Carey. When Jim was about 8 years old, he began making faces in the mirror just to amuse himself. While performing for himself in front of the mirror, he began to do impressions of famous people, and he realized he was quite good at it. At 10, he'd become so confident in his impressions that he sent a letter to Carol Burnett of The Carol Burnett Show asking for a role on the show. He was excited when he received a form letter reply from the show. It was a rejection, sure, but at least his letter was read by someone in show business. Now, before Jim was born, his father had an orchestra in Toronto, but to be something special, he had to leave Canada and come down to the States and prove himself here. He was a little afraid of that transition, and also he had a family to look out for. So he became an accountant. Jim was 13 when his father lost his job and the family became homeless. For a while, Jim's family lived in a Volkswagen van. For months, Jim and his older brother, John, lived in a tent in Charles Daly Park on the southwestern shore of Lake Ontario. But finally, Percy got an accounting job at the Titan Wheels tire factory in Toronto. To ease the family's financial burden, Jim and John worked as janitors and security guards at the tire factory. In 1977, when Jim was 15, Percy helped Jim put together a comedy routine and took him to the recently opened Yuck Yucks Comedy Club in Toronto for his debut performance. It was going to be amazing. So he thought. Jim's impressions just didn't work with that raunchy crowd. Jim was crushed, but his father kept faith in him. Jim understood that his father was projecting, his own thwarted ambitions onto Jim, but with the best of intentions. Jim and Percy kept working on Jim's routine until they had built a successful act around killer impressions. Jim said, "I could have stayed up in Canada and made a really good living doing stand-up, but I always had people going, 'You're too good to stay here. You gotta go to LA, go to LA, go to LA.'" Jim thought long and hard about moving from Canada. His main reason for the move, though, was that he knew his father, who was a really good musician, never made the move, and his dreams and that spark of life dwindled and faded. Jim said, "I wasn't going to let that happen to me." So in 1981, Jim moved to Los Angeles to try to make it in the States. Jim's father had been beaten down by a job that he took because he had to. Jim described his father as beaten down by everything that had happened. Jim became the breadwinner for the family when times were good. Well, when times were good for Jim anyway. When times were bad, Jim was distraught because he was unable to send money back to his struggling family. Jim later said, "I was doing it for my parents. I wanted to provide, do the Elvis fantasy and give them the big house with pillars and all that." But Jim began having bad dreams about his parents, and then he became angry at them. He needed a change. Jim stopped performing and began taking acting lessons. Everyone told him he was crazy. He was the king of impressions. Why would he give that up? Jim ignored them and got small parts in film and television shows. In 1982, Jim was cast as the star of Duck Factory, but the show was canceled after just 13 episodes. Then he was cast in Once Bitten in 1985. Then Peggy Sue Got Married and The Deadpool. Jim eventually went back to stand-up, but he went on stage without a script. His comedy routines were anything but routine. He said whatever came to mind. Jim said, "I created some really fun stuff out of that, but it was horrifying, sink or swim." For the most part, he swam. He was successful. In 1988, he was cast in Earth Girls Are Easy, starring Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis. Jim played an alien named Whitlock alongside Damon Wayans, who played an alien named Zebo. Then in 1989, Keenan Ivory Wayans, brother of Jim's co-star in Earth Girls Are Easy, Damon Wayans, hired Jim for the cast of In Living Color. This show gave Jim Carrey enough freedom to be creative. He tried out for Saturday Night Live several times, but never made the cut. From there, from In Living Color, his career skyrocketed. He starred in films such as Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, Batman Forever, The Cable Guy, Liar Liar. The list just goes on and on. For his part in The Mask, Jim used his father as his motivation. Jim said later, "Not only was my father the funniest man in the room, he was a fantastic saxophone player." Jim remembered how depressed his father had become. As time wore on, it wore him down. He became a little bitter, especially when he lost his job when he was 51. That broke him. When you compromise and you fail, it really hurts. It hurts even more than failing at what you love. Jim has said that disappointments shaped his ambitions. Despite becoming a superstar, his life, he said, is a string of embarrassing moments. I've gone to premieres and tried to make the cool guy exit, and the limo driver locks the keys in the door, and it's running, and he's trying to pick the lock while I'm standing there, and the whole theater is emptying out. I call it the Eugene syndrome because my middle name is Eugene. I always figured my parents named me that to keep me humble. You can never get too cool with a name like Eugene. Now, earlier I said that Jim used his father for inspiration for The Mask. 67-year-old Percy Carey passed away from cancer in September of 1944, just 3 weeks after the release of The Mask. Through the years, Jim used Prozac to help him with his battles with depression, but in recent years, Jim has said that he no longer uses medications to battle depression and also avoids coffee, alcohol, and drugs. Depression can affect all of us, and we need to know when to ask help. You may not need help, but you may know someone who does. Here are some of the symptoms to look for. Feelings of sadness, emptiness, and hopelessness that last for days. Losing interest or pleasure in things you once enjoyed. A change in appetite which leads to weight loss or weight gain. Sleeping too little or too much. An increase in purposeless physical activity such as inability to sit still, pacing, scribbling, slowed movements or speech. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt. Difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, or difficulty making minor decisions. And of course, thoughts of death. If you have some of these symptoms or know someone who has some or all of these symptoms, please talk to a doctor. Don't self-medicate. It's never good. If that person, maybe you, needs help quickly, call or text 988. It could save a life. At a commencement speech at the Maharishi University of Management in 2014, Jim said, "I learned many great lessons from my father, not the least of which was that you can fail at what you don't love, so you might as well take a chance and do what you love." Now that's a lesson we can all learn from Jim's father. We may not end up millionaires like Jim Carrey, but that's okay. We shouldn't measure our worth based on money. Life is short. We should try to use it wisely. Don't you think? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.